Strategies against displacement, forced evictions, and sellout in the context of pandemic times. International Exchange Event on October 28, 2020. Part 1 of 3. Organized by Misereor, with initiatives from New Delhi, India, Durban, Pietermaritzburg, and Cape Town, South Africa, and Berlin, Germany.
Guten Abend, herzlich willkommen zu unserer
Good evening. A warm welcome to our discussion event. Urban political initiatives from India, South Africa, and Berlin will be participating.
Ja, mein Name ist Klaus Teschner. Ich bin
My name is Klaus Techner. I'm an expert on urban development at the Misereor Catholic Aid Organization. I live in Berlin, and I'm very impressed to see what has developed here in terms of urban political or tenants movements. And it has extended far beyond Berlin in terms of its influence. What is equally impressive, however, are the urban movements and initiatives in many parts of the world that I have had the opportunity to familiarize myself with, thanks to my work with Misereor. These movements often face serious difficulties when it comes to overcoming the rift between the wealthy and the poor and social spatial injustice. These movements struggle against a situation in which the majority of the population is forced to live at the margins of the cities in ghettos with poor infrastructure, while the privileged classes segregate themselves in residential areas with large parks or golf courts that are also a kind of buffer zone to keep the dispossessed out. Now, this may seem exotic, but it's a reality that's not so far removed from what we have here. What unites these struggles all over the world is the certainty that we are dealing with questions of justice, that we are concerned with the right to housing in a decisive sense, and that the right to housing is an inalienable human right, which, like many other rights associated with it, continues to be disrespected. But what unites us is also the experience that the issues that we will be dealing with tonight are closely linked to the fact that in the globally dominant neoliberal paradigm, in the capitalist economic system, the logic of capital valorization is considered more important than the needs of human beings. Key words would be real estate speculation, displacement, financialization of markets, and so on. So that's the background. Last year, we were able to organize a visit by initiatives from Cape Town to Berlin, and the initiatives that will be represented here tonight will still remember this event. This was an important learning experience for us, and it was a matter of having an exchange on really basic issues. How can we organize ourselves? What should we be demanding? Are we perhaps too modest in our demands? How can we build alliances? What tools have proven useful? Legal means, media work, and so on. And how can we develop a solidary way of engaging with one another? These kinds of encounters are not possible at present because of the COVID-19 pandemic, which we could say has changed everything. And yet, in a sense, everything has changed and everything is the same. The problems have remained the same. They have been aggravated. It's become more difficult to organize. Yes, it's become more difficult to organize protest. But on the other hand, we're seeing evictions and displacement in India, in South Africa, here in Berlin. I would just refer to the Liebig 34 project. People are worried about losing their apartments or their workshops, their stores, because they cannot pay the rent. And at the same time, large corporations are in shopping mode, such as the Swedish investor Heimstatt, which is purchasing 4,000 apartments in Berlin to sell them. We're hearing similar questions from India, South Africa, Brazil, and many parts of the world. That's why it's important to engage in an exchange, in a strategic exchange on how to engage with these threats right now. And that's why we organized this event, Strategies Against Displacement, Evictions, and Sellout During the Pandemic. We're only going to be able to touch on the issues tonight, but we believe we will have achieved something if we simply begin to engage in a dialogue. This communication is something that should extend beyond tonight's events. And when we talk about a strategic exchange, that involves the initiatives here in Berlin engaging with one another and the initiatives from South Africa engaging with one another. So I'm glad to have such extraordinary panelists here tonight. They are part of equally extraordinary movements and organizations who have developed new concepts and strategies, who have opened up political spaces of possibility that didn't seem to exist before, and who have formulated demands that didn't used to be part of the public debate. This is a hybrid event. There are 4 panelists here in Berlin and another 8 people who are also our panelists who are participating via Zoom from Berlin, from India, and from South Africa. 5 people here in Berlin are taking care of the technical side of tonight's event and the interpretation. So a warm thank you to our technical support. There's also Clara, our co-facilitator, who will be collecting questions and comments in the chat, because we would like to give people listening to us online the possibility of asking questions and formulating comments. So perhaps, Clara, you can just briefly explain some technical issues to us. Thank you, Klaus, and a warm welcome from me too. I work with Klaus at Misereor in the Department on Politics and Questions Concerning the Global Future, with a focus on urbanization and socio-ecological urban development. And I'm very much looking forward to tonight's event and the exchange between these various very exciting initiatives that are assembled here tonight. So if you are listening online, if you have questions, please write them in the chat or use the question and answer tool, and we will make an effort at the end of each section of tonight's event to pass those questions on to our speakers, so that those questions can become a part of our discussion. Tonight's event will also be recorded, so there will be the possibility of listening to it all online afterwards. And I believe that's all I need to say for now. So, Klaus, you have the floor again. Thank you, Clara.
Die Mitglieder unseres 12-köpfigen Podiums, also
members of our panel, which consists of 12 people in total, represent various organizations, a great many organizations, obviously, that I can't introduce one by one. That would take too long. But we have compiled brief written statements from each organization, and the document in which those statements have been compiled can be read in English and in German. I suppose Clara will provide a link, a URL, and those of you interested in those statements by the various organizations can then do that online. So we're going to now begin with the first section of tonight's event, and we don't want to lose too much time with introductions. We're going to hear from Shivani Chaudhry from New Delhi first. We're very happy to have her with us tonight. Of course, it's quite late in New Delhi right now. It's 10:30 in the evening.
Well,
Shivani is well known and a very experienced expert on human rights. She's been working in the field for 20 years, knows a great deal about the right to housing, and she's the director of the Housing and Land Rights Network from India. Thank you, Shivani, for participating at this advanced hour. We will also be hearing from Mqapheli Bonono, the vice president of the South African social movement Abahlali baseMjondolo, the largest social movement in South Africa, struggling for the right to housing and for the improvement of their settlements and for housing programs. And then we'll also be hearing this first section of tonight's event from Denver, Arendse, from the Reclaim the City movement in Cape Town, which is struggling to do away with the racist segregation of Cape Town into a city of the wealthy on the one hand and a city of the poor on the other hand. Following these three inputs, we will have a brief question and answer session, and then we will have a short break.
Gebe jetzt also zurück an Shivani. Shivani,
it's wonderful to have you with us tonight.
It's great to have you here with us. Please, the floor is yours now.
Good evening from New Delhi, and thank you so much, Klaus, and to everyone at Misereor for organizing this event and for inviting me to speak on an extremely important issue of forced evictions. At any time, forced evictions constitute a gross violation of human rights, especially the right to adequate housing. But during a pandemic, they are a direct assault on the right to life and the right to health. And it is extremely disturbing and actually horrifying that evictions are continuing in so many countries across the world at a time when every government is asking people to stay at home, to stay safe. And this is a global health directive. However, we have large populations of people who do not have homes. For instance, in India, it is estimated that at least 4 million people just in urban areas live in homelessness, and they are at heightened risk of contracting the coronavirus. But what's equally shocking is that, at one level, the state has not taken care of their needs to provide them adequate housing. And on the other, it is continuously demolishing homes of the urban and rural poor who have housing, however inadequate it may be, since the beginning of the pandemic. At Housing and Land Rights Network, we have documented over 20,000 people who have been forcefully evicted since the beginning of the pandemic between 15th March and 31st July this year. And we're currently in the process of updating our data, and we will be issuing a press release next week. And we have found that almost about the same number have been evicted in the last 3 months. So at a time when states are entrusted with protecting the lives of their people from this deadly pandemic, we are finding that they are actually rendering people homeless. And what's horrifying is that in all the incidents, 45 incidents of eviction that we have documented in India until July, there has been no due process followed, no prior notice, no consultation with people, no information, and no resettlement. So all these people have been rendered homeless. And we find that there is absolutely very limited access to justice or remedy for them. Now, the reasons for evictions in the global south are a little different from what you're experiencing in Europe and the United States, where evictions are increasing and likely to increase more because eviction moratoriums are expiring and people are unable to pay their rent on account of the severe economic crisis induced by the pandemic. Whereas in countries like India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Nepal, Brazil, to some extent South Africa, we're seeing more evictions taking place by the state. And this is largely for what they call city beautification projects, renewal programs, and also a very disturbing reason is that of removal of encroachments. And in the eyes of the state, the urban and rural poor who live on state land continue to be perceived as encroachers, even though very often they have documents to prove their residence, they have government issued identification cards, but whenever the government needs the land, and very often they don't even need the land. Just today, 150 houses have been demolished in Delhi. It is absolutely extremely disturbing and inhumane for the state to continue demolishing. Last week, 20 houses in a remote village in Chhattisgarh were demolished and then set on fire, and the fields of the people were set on fire because the government perceives people as encroachers. So when the state continuously perceives its poor as encroachers on their own land, we are faced with a very serious crisis. And all this is taking place in India, which now has close to 8 million COVID cases with over 120,000 deaths. So the public health crisis is very severe. And these are people who have suffered greatly from one of the world's harshest lockdowns. They have lost their livelihoods. They are suffering extreme loss of income. Many of them are on the brink of starvation, and to lose their homes and all their possessions by the systematic dispossession drives of the state is something that we're finding very difficult to deal with. So in the next few minutes that I have, I would like to just share some of the strategies that we have adopted at Housing and Land Rights Network India to deal with this very disturbing crisis of forced evictions. So the first strategy is that of monitoring and documentation. So at the official level, there is no data in India on forced evictions, and our organization is the only organization in the entire country that is attempting to track evictions. So we have found that over the last 3 years, close to 600,000 people have been evicted from their homes by the state. We believe that without adequate data, there cannot be adequate policy response. And that's why we have been very meticulously trying to document evictions during the pandemic at a time when the government is asking people to stay home. We use this data to then pressure the government to respond, to take action. We are also working closely with the media to make sure that people know about the crisis, because a large number of people have no idea about these evictions and they are seldom reported in the mainstream media. So a lot of our work is trying to get the media to sensitize people about this crisis. So we are also regularly issuing press releases in order to make this happen. Our second strategy is that of sustained advocacy with government officials at the local, state, and national level. And so we constantly are writing letters to the government. The minute we hear about an eviction, we are alerting them about what's happening and the gross violations of human rights. Even before COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic, we had written to the Indian government warning them that there is a need to issue a moratorium on evictions and to take care of those who are inadequately housed, because they do not have space to practice physical distancing. They do not have access to water to wash their hands frequently. And to our surprise, the government did take this seriously, and it asked all states in India to develop a COVID-19 policy to deal with housing of the marginalized. So we're still waiting to see what happens. But these are some of our consistent efforts to put pressure on the state at all levels to meet its national and international legal obligations. The third strategy is that of working directly with communities to enable them to access justice. So we help them to reach out to state and national human rights institutions. We help them to file complaints. We file complaints on their behalf to ask for investigations into violations related to forced evictions. Or we also assist local communities to access United Nations mechanisms, including Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing. So we help communities to write and file complaints with special procedures. And we also, as a last resort, help communities to access courts. Because very often what happens is when the bulldozer is at your doorstep, you need to get a stay order from a court to stop the eviction. And last week, we were encouraged. We got a very positive order from the Allahabad High Court in the state of Uttar Pradesh in India, where the court actually ordered the demolition to stop, but it also ordered compensation for all 250 families that had suffered the eviction, as well as alternative housing. And this is rare in India because mostly the courts stop at giving stay orders to demolitions, or even when they uphold the right to housing, they don't always give relief. So this has been a great success for us. The court has actually ordered relief for victims of forced eviction. The next strategy is that of human rights education and really trying to work with communities to make them aware of their rights. So we have developed a handbook on how to respond to forced evictions. It deconstructs international law, national law, explain to people what their rights are, and also what are the mechanisms they can access to gain justice and redress in situations of forced evictions, as well as which are the organizations in their state that they can reach out to. And we have developed this handbook now for 9 states in India. It's available in 6 Indian languages. And we found this to be very useful for local communities who are faced with evictions as well as threat of evictions. So we also work on documenting eviction threats and then working with communities and governments, very often at the local level, to try to prevent evictions. And over the last 2 years, as a direct result of our efforts, we have been able to prevent 30,000 people from losing their homes. So given the scale of the crisis, it may not sound like a huge number, but it's still significant. And of course, we realize that there is so much more that needs to be done. We also have a forced eviction alert mechanism. So on our website, we have a form where anybody can enter data on forced evictions and send us a message, and we can reach out to them and help them. We also have an alert mechanism on social media where we continuously spread awareness on evictions and the related human rights violations. And lastly, I want to talk about how we are trying to develop stronger networks to deal with evictions. And in Delhi, we have created something known as the Delhi Housing Rights Task Force. And this consists of human rights activists, civil society organizations, academics, lawyers. So bringing together people with different expertise, urban planners, architects, who then come together and try to respond to evictions as well as to prevent evictions. So some of you might be aware that the Supreme Court of India, the highest court of our country, actually has asked for communities living along railway tracks in India to be removed within the next 3 months, at the time of this crisis of the pandemic. And so the task force has actually submitted a plan to the central government and the Delhi government as to how this relocation should take place. Of course, we are using the documents and guidance notes of the special rapporteurs that have very strongly said no evictions during the pandemic. And we are trying to spread awareness about these documents, but also then insisting on consultation using the United Nations eviction guidelines that call for due process and respect for human rights at all stages of evictions, trying to mandate evictions only in exceptional circumstances, where the health and well-being of people are at risk. So I think that's some of the strategies that I wanted to share today, and I don't have much time. But I would just like to end by saying that the pandemic has really heightened the critical importance of housing to people's lives and health. This is something that all of us have been working on and insisting, but the pandemic has really put it up front that, you need a safe and secure home to stay alive and to be well. And it's really important that eviction moratoriums are considered a part of the strategy in dealing with COVID in all countries. And, we are calling for a human rights-based recovery, but we have to put the right to adequate housing at the center. And that's something that at Housing and Land Rights Network, we are really striving for, mainstreaming the human rights approach to housing, but really struggling for everyone to have secure housing and land rights to enable them to live with dignity. So thank you very much. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from your experiences from other parts of the world. And I apologize that I'm not able to stay till the end of the session, but I am very grateful to be here. So thank you very much.
Vielen Dank,
Thank you, Shivani.
They are clapping here on the panel.
Thank you very much for this wonderful, very impressive report.
Diese Herleitung aus den
for the way you drew attention to the state's responsibility for human rights and the issue of eviction and displacement, which we will probably be concerned with all night, tonight. What Shivani just said about the importance of housing is something that's become very clear in this time, and there shouldn't really be any evictions and displacement under today's circumstances. That takes me to our next speaker, Mqapheli Bonono, from Abahlali baseMjondolo. This organization has also compiled a documentation similar to the Housing and Land Rights Network in India, a documentation on the evictions and the destruction of informal settlements during the time of the pandemic, mainly in Durban. Mqapheli, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, comrade, to all comrades that are presented on the panel today. Also, thank you very much to Misereor for organizing this platform for us to come and share our experiences, especially in this 6 months period of this pandemic that we have been facing. Thank you very much, comrade, for also Abahlali to entrust me to come and present the Schedulers movement in this platform. Thank you very much for inviting Abahlali baseMjondolo to add our voice, our position in difficult moment in our history. COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the inequalities that exist in our society. It has created poverty and job loss in a society where unemployment has risen to unfrightened height. COVID-19 has also exposed the lies of our democracy that continue to serve the interest of the few while the majority continue to live in objective poverty. Sheepdwellers and people in rural villages have been asked to wash their hands now and again to promote hygiene as part of the precautionary measures of the flattening of the curve of the virus and as part of the national regulation. This regulation suggests that everyone has a running clean water when the well-known truth is that these communities do not have water and sanitation. For past 15 years, we have been organizing around these basic services for all these years, and we have seen the lies that is been exposed by this COVID-19. But in the 6 months period that our government, they have all the resources to make sure that they can manage to serve people with clean water. The national regulation also asks citizens to keep the social distance, now given the uncrowding that sheepdwellers and poor communities face. How does one keep social distance when all this settlement that people are live, no one, takes time and come and be part of living, and then just to do the reblocking to make sure that people have spaces and the places for the children just to play and to make sure that the places are clean. People are also told to stay at home. People who are already impoverished, having no income even prior COVID-19, and how are they supposed to stay at home without food and the table? Many families have been forced out of their land and have had their homes destroyed by the City Land Invasion Unit, the Metropolis, Calvin and Family Security Company. These evictions are taking place in the middle of the pandemic. 20 women of Azania and Ekenana have had to arrested in the police custody when they were arrested under the false pretense of the national lockdown regulations. The police forced them to commit not to return to their occupation in exchange to be released. The women refused to sign the papers and told the police that the occupation is the only home they have, and therefore could they rather be kept in custody, saying that women were not threatened by the detection or death were later released and again. So we have seen that when the women of Kenana, also in Azania, when in Wakito police station that, you know, with all forces, Metro Police, even the soldiers came to the occupation, arrested those women, put them in the custody. When they were in the custody, but now they wanted to do an exchange that in order on them that if they want to be released, so they must sign the papers that they are not going back to their occupation. And then the women have refused and said the occupation is only the home that we have. There were a number of accidents where people were shot and brutally injured during forced removals and against the national state of disaster and against worldwide monitoring of all evictions. We have seen this, that the government, even here, the Minister of Human Settlement in South Africa, they also have issued a statement is that people, they should not go and demolish people's homes, but we have seen the government as the one that they are leading, breaking the law and going to demolish people's housing. It was very hard to organize to all and these forces against our people. Organizing under all these conditions, comrades, including brutal and unlawful eviction that landless and homeless people face every day, has not been easy. However, the reality is that inactivities and progressive forces do not act now, possibilities of building strong and independent people's movement in post-COVID-19 pandemic, unlikely to succeed if we do not act now. The time is now, otherwise you are likely to get up one day with no movement. At time of crisis like now, people need people's movement right now. Abahlali has used this moment as an opportunity to organize. This is how we have been organized. Educated and encourage our structures in our branches to set up WhatsApp group, train our leaders to use Zoom and Microsoft as means of communication. So it was very time if you come to see the members of Abahlali as people that have lost hope, people that, you know, they've been unorganized for quite a long time. So when you get to them, and people that have been denied the right to education, people that have been denied the right to have this Wi-Fi and also this data, the internet, so that when they are stayed at home, they can be able to have an access to read what is happening in the wild in the country. So Abahlali, we have managed to make sure that how can we train our people to make sure that we can be able to collect the communication and the information from the ground where the people are really forcing this oppression against from the state. Because as we know that we have been given the mandate that we have to stay at home, and then we could not move out. So we have been gathering information from the ground on how communities respond to COVID-19 pandemic and what could be our role as leaders. Organize and educate our communities on new normal. Engage our communities in food solidarity distributing program, of course, with the generosity of our partners and comrades. Engaging the state at all levels to be part of the solution to all challenges affecting our communities, the diversification of our settlement and availability of land. Demand the provision of basic services such as water, tanks, and sanitation in our settlement. Resist and litigate the evictions. So we have seen this in this part of this eviction as one of the first speakers that has told us that in South Africa and India, it's been a lot of eviction that have been taking place. So we have drawn some lessons in these 6 months of part of pandemic. The lessons that we have learned is that the state has been brutally and unfair in the impoverished eviction, have continued under national lockdown, which is against the law. Courage and power of the struggle from below. This moment is an opportunity to build unity and solidarity within between struggling organization and communities. It is time to identify and now your allies. It is time to intensify our call for land redistribution as the expropriation bill is before Parliament. It is also time to build hope in our organization and communities and get rid of anger and an exit which contribute to our gender-based violence in our societies. So these lessons that we have been drawn in this period of 6 months, we have seen the impoverished people that are living in informal settlement, people that are unemployed, people that they were told to stay at home with no food. And then we have seen the arising of the gender-based violence, because people have been asked to stay at home and then with no food. So people that we have seen in our government that taking no place, and people, the gender-based violence in South Africa has gone up and at a high level. So we have drawn these lessons that if the leaders of the organization that they don't build the allies and other organization to make sure in order to build the solidarity, because we've seen if you are alone and without this organization, especially when the women that they were arrested, we have seen all organizations around the world signing, all these petitions, making sure that they also release the pressure from the movement. So today we are here to this platform calling to all the progressive forces to join Abahlali, to join all other organizations that are really there to defend the poor people, to make sure that this eviction, we get rid of it, and this state violence. So I would like to end there and say thank you very much, comrade. And I'm also willing to learn more and hear more from other comrades. I thank you.
Thank you, Mqapheli, for this engaged report, for this engaged statement.
Thank you, Mqapheli, for this engaged statement and for reminding us how important solidarity is. We will probably go on to speak some more about solidarity, how to organize it, what it means, what we can achieve internationally. Abahlali, of course, tried to engage an international public, and this leads us back to Cape Town, from Durban to Cape Town. We're now going to hear from Denver Arendse, who will talk to us about the Reclaim the City movement and about the ways in which the movement is currently dealing with evictions and displacement, and we'll also be hearing about the significance of land occupation.
Denver, the floor is yours, please.
Hi, good evening once again. Shivani and our comrade from Abahlali have spoken, well, especially Shivani, where she mentioned what they are doing, and it's almost in a similar way as and RTC is doing it. Also, I wanted to keep it to the end, but the call that Abahlali is calling out for us to join globally is actually what Reclaim the Cities is calling out for as well. Reclaim the City is looking at 3 ways to work around strategically tackling and coping with evictions. Firstly, to have a political discussion with other movements concerning land and housing struggles, to discuss who holds the power to land and housing, and with the displacement, and which brings the gentrification of the poor and working class people and communities. Secondly, to discuss workshop our history of dispossession. Once again, our comrade from Abahlali says that repossession of land, that is a whole workshop discussion debate on its own. Thirdly, to discuss the issue of homelessness by having a dialogue where we could come together to listen to one another, because we know that evictions and displacements of the poor and working class causes homelessness. Hence, it is important to unpack this issue while facing a global pandemic, this COVID-19, and to look at the 4 different examples of homelessness, near homelessness, which is the occupations, informal settlements, which is and relocation camps, where we know how people live in such circumstances with no toilets, or there's a bucket system that needs to be used. People with no water, no electricity, and some of these relocation camps is right in the outskirts of the city, where traveling back is of a very big concern. The economic and situation homelessness, which is brought about by unemployment, high rise in rentals and rates, hardship, pandemic and illness, natural disaster, which we have the chronic homelessness, which is better known as street homelessness. Now, altogether with this, we are trying to work to have a global networking and to work as collective to show solidarity support by taking a stand against injustice and evictions, by releasing updated press releases, drafting letters, emails, to use the power of ideas of media to amplify our voices so that we can globally tackle this issue and challenges. What we are also familiar with is the use of right-based education, where we have advice assemblies in our occupation, where we teach people about their rights, their basic rights, about eviction matters. We have also online assemblies and social media to raise awareness, where we also have radio now as well. By looking at different types of evictions, the unlawful evictions, forced removals, displacements, and learning and teaching one another the legal steps in an eviction process, so that we can hold the courts, the police, law enforcement, and different spheres of government to account for these injustices. Also, you set up task teams to do the actual support by physically resisting evictions, blockading entrances, doing sit-ins at government institutions, by doing exercises at the home offices of officials to hold them to account. Other physical support in eviction matters is to do court support, court monitoring, and stand in solidarity with tenants, occupiers, and vulnerable communities. In some instances, we too need legal representation to defend the struggle overall. And the reinstatement of the rental board because of rent hikes that is spearing up in our communities, where people will eventually not be able to pay these rates. Also, our occupations is beginning to become very limited, and with that, the eviction processes is still ongoing right through this pandemic, and we don't know, or maybe we should learn here how we can put a stop to that. Is that okay?
Thank you, Denver.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Vielen Dank für diesen
Thank
sehr
you
lebendigen
for this
Bericht
very
aus
lively
der
report
Stadt
from
von
Cape Town.
City,
And
City.
on the Reclaim the City movement, which struggled not just by means of legal means, but also through actions trying to defend themselves against such illegal acts as displacement under these conditions. So we've heard three talks with a great many similarities. Of course, there are always various strategies, legal means, direct action, addressing the government or engaging in public relations work, right down to educational work in the field of human rights education. The question, of course, is what can we do as organizations under today's circumstances? We'll be dealing with that later on tonight. Clara, do we have any questions from the chat that we could pass on to our speakers?
Genau, also es kam eine
Well,
Frage,
there was a question. It's just come in. I haven't even finished reading it yet. I would read it out loud to you. It's in English.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. There's one question to Shivani. Shivani is still here, as far as I know. So the question is, I understand that the United Nations mechanisms are to be a last resort, for example, used when all other channels for recourse within the country has been followed. Does your use of this mechanism imply that you've reached this point in India? What has been some of the outcomes from submissions complaints to the United Nations complaints procedure? And how has your government responded to the findings and recommendations? This is the question to Shivani. I don't know if you want to respond directly to that. And there's another question to Bonobo that I would pose then afterwards.
Sure. Would you like me to respond or no?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so thanks for the question. I don't think the United Nations mechanisms are the last for us in our work. It's an additional tool and a pressure point for the government, and also for us in India, where we don't have a very strong recognition of the right to adequate housing in national law and policy. The United Nations mechanisms and standards are very important for us in our advocacy with the state. So we use these standards for the eviction guidelines, the moratorium on evictions, and I think it's also part of our public education work, including with lawyers and judges. And courts in India have also very often referred to these standards. So I think they're very important, and I think they accompany us in our local and national level strategies and work. In terms of how the government responds, we did have a specific mission to India by the Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing in 2016. In her report also, she specifically called for a national moratorium on evictions. Of course, most governments are not very warm to criticism of the human rights, the lack of the human rights protections for people. So the Indian government also has not been very favorable in terms of receiving these recommendations or in terms of implementing them. However, we do find at some times that local government officials do refer to these standards, and I think part of our work is to try to get them implemented. So they are hugely important, and we need to work to encourage governments that this is constructive. It's constructive. It's helping to build their human rights commitments to international law. It's also helping to improve the lives and livelihoods of the people within the country. So it's not something that should be perceived as a negative report. And I think using mechanisms like the Universal Periodic Review, where governments give each other recommendations is also helpful. And I think maybe, since we are looking at global strategies, how to get evictions, more on the center stage of international advocacy, I think, because we do have good standards, but states do not implement them. So maybe that's something in the later discussions that we could look at. So I think I'll stop here. Thanks.
Danke,
Thank you,
Shivani. Ich
Shivani.
habe gerade von
Milun
Mqapheli noch
Qutari
den
has
Hinweis
just
bekommen, dass
said that he
auch
would
gerne
also
dazu noch
like to
ergänzen würde.
add
Deshalb
to
würde ich ihm
that,
jetzt
so I
auch
would give
noch
him
mal
the
kurz
opportunity to
das Wort
speak briefly.
Milun.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I just wanted to respond to that question about the UN mechanisms. I think we need to understand that there are different parts of the UN system. So the UN treaty bodies which monitor compliance with, let's say, the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights and others, some of them have complaint mechanisms. If you want to appeal to them, you have to exhaust domestic remedies, right? You have to go through your whole court system. But the special rapporteurs, for example, you don't have to do that. You can go whenever there's a threat of a violation, whenever there's a violation, whenever there are evictions, you can directly approach the rapporteurs and they can issue public statements, press releases, they can carry out a communication. You can even appeal to rapporteurs when you see that there is a law that is being drafted which is not consistent with human rights obligations. So I think as part of the human rights education process, perhaps we need to explain in simple terms to everybody what are the different parts of the UN system that we can utilize, and at different times we can use different systems. We can also use them jointly. So I just wanted to clarify that you don't have to exhaust all national options before you appeal to the UN human rights mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you, Milun, for this clarification. I haven't introduced Milun yet. He will be speaking at greater length later. He is the former and, in fact, the first United Nations Special Rapporteur for the Right to Housing, or he held that office between 2000 and 2008, and will be giving a concluding statement tonight before we begin our discussion. I think the point he made about the human rights system is very important, and I might add self-critically that we, as representatives of the German tenants movement or as representatives of German social movements, don't make enough use of this instrument. We always assume that the German government respects human rights, which is not the case. It's not that we couldn't make use of this instrument here, and that is something that we should reflect upon. So that might be a point to discuss in the discussion later on. Clara, there was a question for Denver.
Genau.
Well, actually, it was not for Denver. It was for Mqapheli,
Bonono.
and I will be posing this question in English.
Ich stelle die Frage nochmal auf Englisch. So you mentioned that people have been asked.
Yes, can you repeat the question for me?
Oh, yeah. Do you hear me? I will pose the
Yes.
question in English. Yeah. You mentioned that people have been asked to sign forms saying that they not return to the occupation when arrested following an eviction. Were there consequences for those who did not sign? And if so, what were they? Do you know of anyone that did sign? And what were the consequences if they returned to the occupation?
No, thank you very much. The question is very clear. The lessons that we have drawn, we have seen when these women, when they were arrested, POP police and also the army and Metro police, and then the private company security, they managed to collect them from the occupation and put them in a custody in Kwaito police station in Mayville. None of these women have signed, and when they didn't sign, the results of that, all of them, they were released and without being sent even to court. So that was a lesson that, so it was a threat to them that leave this occupation. So because you didn't commit any crime and any sort of violating the regulation of the Regulation Act. But what the answer is that all the women, they were released without any one of them because they've resisted to sign and say, look, the occupation is only the home that we have. If you ask us not to return back to our occupation, it's better for you to keep us in this custody. So when the Abahlali, then we have to organize the legal team to try and engage the police station that can we get a police bail to make sure that they are out? And then we didn't even pay the bail, and then they were released just because. And then that way we have seen that the women, they were really threatened that they must leave what they are really facing in their occupation. So the answer, yes, no one has signed that paper, and then no one was arrested. After that, they were released.
Thank you, Mqapheli. I believe there are no further questions. No additional questions